good to be back with you this evening. We appreciate everyone's presence. I suppose one of the most discussed topics in the New Testament is that of the resurrection. It's a promise upon which all of our hope for eternity rests. In fact, as 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 19 says, if in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied. This life cannot be all that there is. And Jesus and his apostles made it very clear that it is not. But in Matthew 22 and verse 23, let me see if I can get my slides working here. Matthew 22 and verse 33, we find an interesting note that's made there about a certain sect of the Jews known as the Sadducees. Matthew writes, the same day Sadducees came to him who say that there is no resurrection, and they asked him a question. Similar descriptions of this group are given in both Mark's and Luke's accounts. Furthermore, in Acts 23, we find the Apostle Paul encountering those of this sect, the Sadducees. He was on trial there, and he was giving his defense before the chief priests and the Jewish council. And it wasn't going well for Paul at first, but then he recognized an opportunity to divide the crowd and perhaps to draw some of them to his side. And so we read there in Acts 23, beginning with verse 6, now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply. We find nothing wrong in this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. And so Paul's idea or trick, if you will, worked here. Well, recently I was struck by the realization here that some of the Jews, some of God's supposedly chosen people, would not believe in the resurrection. How could that be? In fact, as Luke plainly records here, some of them, particularly the Sadducees, did not even believe in angel or spirit. And as I understand it, that means they completely denied the existence of the spiritual world altogether. Well, that's hard for us to understand. How can you claim to believe in God and everything that we know about God and what He's told us about Him and not believe in such things? But then that brought to mind the question, before Jesus and before His apostles so clearly preached about the resurrection, and before His own resurrection from the dead that certainly proved its validity, exactly what did the Jews know about life after death? What did God's people, the Israelites, believe concerning the resurrection? What evidence of the resurrection can be found in Old Testament scriptures? Well, as I discovered, quite a bit. And so for a little while this afternoon, I'd like to notice with you some evidence that I believe proves that God has shared the hope of the resurrection with His people from the beginning. And let's begin by returning to Matthew 22, which we read from earlier, and notice Jesus' response to these Sadducees and their question. We'll read again verse 23, and then we'll continue on through verse 33 there of Matthew 22. Again, it says, the same day Sadducees came to him, who say that there is no resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses said if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no offspring left his wife to his brother. So too the second and third, down to the 7th. After them all, the woman died. In the resurrection, notice they don't believe in the resurrection, but they're posing this hypothetical question, I suppose. In the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, whose wife will she be? For they all had her. But Jesus answered them, "You are wrong." Notice, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. By the way, they didn't believe in angels either. And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not God of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astonished at his teaching. And so again, even though these Sadducees didn't even believe in the resurrection, they tried to trip Jesus up by proposing this hypothetical, or at least highly improbable scenario. Jesus, as always, knew just how to answer them. First of all, he clarified that in the resurrection, we won't be married. And so that solved their problem that they had posed. But then he took it further. Again, these Sadducees posed this resurrection quandary, if you will, pretending as if they believed in such. But Jesus knew better. He knew their minds and their hearts. And so he took this opportunity to further point out their error in not believing in the resurrection. And what I want us to notice is how he reprimanded them for not knowing the Scriptures. In other words, Jesus is obviously implying that the Scriptures, the Old Testament, clearly taught the resurrection. But what Old Testament Scriptures could he be referring to? Well, let's notice a few. We'll begin with the one that I believe Jesus uses here in his rebuke of the Sadducees. He says, "Haven't you read what was spoken to you by God?" And then he goes on to quote Exodus 3 and verse 6. Now that's quite significant, because it turns out that not only did the Sadducees not believe in a lot of those things that we've mentioned, but they also did not give much credence to the Old Testament books of poetry, such as Proverbs and Psalms. They didn't give much credence to the Old Testament books of prophecy. And all of those spoke on numerous occasions of the resurrection, as we'll notice. They really only saw credibility in the first 5 books, the books of Moses or the Torah. Well, as I said, Jesus here quotes Exodus 3 and verse 6. It's a scene there in the life of none other than Moses. And it's that scene at the burning bush that we're all very familiar with, when God first introduces himself to Moses. And he says, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Now, the verb that's used there, "I am," is in the present tense. And so God's not just saying, "I was the God of these beloved patriarchs who have long since passed on." He's saying, "I am now, today, the God of these men." How could that be if they no longer existed? If, as the Sadducees believed, death basically equals annihilation and nothingness, then God would be saying, "I'm the God of nothing." But rather, as Jesus implies, they are living. But I think Jesus' argument here is more than just one of verb tense. The Jews equated Abraham with the idea of the covenant that God made with him. The promise that God made to make him a great nation and give him a home in the land of Canaan. Now, obviously, that did not all come to pass during Abraham's lifetime. As Hebrews 11 and verse 13 says, Abraham died in faith, not having received the things promised. In fact, even as Jesus spoke these words, it was still yet to be fulfilled. As Brother Mike Criswell points out in his commentary on these verses, and by the way, I highly recommend reading all that Brother Mike has to say. He unfolds the brilliance of Jesus' argument in detail here. But he says, in order for the words, "I am the God of Abraham," to have any real substantive meaning, Abraham must be alive in at least some sense and awaiting fulfillment of the covenant. Now, speaking of Abraham, we have evidence that he himself believed in the resurrection. You remember that God had promised, even in his old age, that he would have a son, Isaac, and that through him would come the fulfillment of God's covenant. But yet in Genesis 22, God instructs Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Well, how can that be? How could Abraham keep his faith in God under such circumstances? Well, again, the writer of Hebrews gives us a clue. In Hebrews 11 and 19, he says Abraham, he considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead. Abraham must have considered resurrection, at least as a possibility. Let's move on now, and notice some other instances in the Old Testament where the resurrection is taught. As we've said in the books of poetry and prophecy, it's mentioned quite a bit. There are several passages, for example, in the Psalms, which seem to refer to life after death, although it's sometimes in figurative or poetic language. For example, in Psalm 16 and verse 10, David rejoices, "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption." Now, Sheol here refers to the Hebrew concept of the dwelling place of the dead. Sometimes it can simply refer to the grave, or sometimes it refers to the underworld or the afterlife, the place where souls go after they leave their earthly bodies. It's a place of waiting, similar to the Greek concept of Hades. And I realize that there may be some debate about whether David and other Psalms are strictly personal, or whether they are speaking of the future, whether they're messianic. That is, whether David is referring to himself here, or if he also looks forward to Jesus, the Messiah. But in Acts, the 2nd chapter, on the day of Pentecost, Peter made direct application of this particular psalm to Jesus and his resurrection. At the climax of his great sermon there on the day of Pentecost, showing that Jesus was the Son of God who they had crucified, he says there in Acts 2 and verse 24, "God raised him up, loosing the pangs of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by it." And then he says, beginning in verse 25, "For David says concerning him," and he goes on to quote a passage from Psalm 16, including verse 10 that we just noticed, "For you will not abandon my soul to Hades." And so at least in Peter's eyes, Psalm 16 spoke of Jesus' resurrection. References to resurrection in the Psalms are not just limited to Jesus' resurrection, though. In Psalm 49, the writer makes it clear that all will face death. In verses 6 through 9, he says that no one is rich enough to bribe God or pay for his own life. You will never have enough money to buy the right to live forever and keep your body out of the grave. In verse 10, he says that the wise die the same as fools. But in verse 15 there of Psalm 49, we find a ray of hope. There the psalmist says, "But God will ransom my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me." The psalmist here clearly believes that after he dies, God will rescue him from this place, Sheol, whether that means the grave or whether that means the afterlife. Not only that, but God will receive him. And I like how the NIV translates this verse. It says, "But God will redeem me from the realm of the dead. He will surely take me to himself." And that adds a wonderful layer, if you will, to the idea of resurrection. And that is that not only is there life after death, but we have the opportunity to spend that life with God. There are several other references in the Psalms that at least appear to suggest the idea of resurrection. As I stated, sometimes it's difficult to determine if they're only speaking of the writer's immediate misfortunes and being saved from those, or if it's something beyond that. For example, Psalm 71 reflects on past misfortunes and future deliverance. And then it declares in verse 20, "You who have made me see many troubles and calamities will revive me again. From the depths of the earth you will bring me up again." Or Psalm 103 and verse 4, which blesses the Lord who redeems your life from the pit. I'll mention just a few others here for those taking notes. Psalm 17:15, Psalm 21 and verse 4, Psalm 22 verse 29, and Psalm 23 and verse 6. Now that last one is a verse that we all know well. We maybe even can quote it by memory, along with all of Psalm 23. But I'm not sure I'd really ever connected it to the idea of resurrection, at least not as clearly as I believe I see it now. It says there, again, you can probably quote it yourself, Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. In other words, until death. And I shall dwell or live in the house of the Lord forever. And so I will face death, but then I will live forever. I think clearly there we see the idea of life after death. And once again, in the Lord's presence for eternity. Well, moving on, besides the many references to the resurrection in the Psalms, the Old Testament prophets also made mention of this idea on several occasions. For example, take the prophet Hosea. I'm sorry, I didn't forward my slide there in the Psalms. But the prophet Hosea, after division of the kingdom into Israel and Judah, Hosea preached a message of love and forgiveness to the people of Israel and tried to urge them to repent. And in Hosea 6 and verse 2, he announces, after 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up that we may live before him. Now, once again, that's not necessarily a reference to literal physical resurrection from the dead. In fact, I think it probably more than likely refers to the promise of returning them from exile. I only mention it because I think we can all see the obvious similarities in what he says here and Jesus' resurrection on the third day. In 1 Corinthians 15, as Paul is describing the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus, he says in verses 3 and 4, "For I delivered to you first of all that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day," notice, according to the Scriptures. Now, depending on how you rearrange those words, and I'm certainly not a Greek expert, but Paul could be saying in general that Christ's death, burial, and resurrection were according to the Scriptures. But perhaps he's also saying that this third day resurrection is according to the Scriptures. And if so, the only reference that I know of to that would be Hosea 6 and verse 2. Regardless, there's another prophecy in Hosea that makes an obvious reference to resurrection. In Hosea 13 and verse 14, God says, "I shall ransom them from the power of Sheol. I shall redeem them from death. O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your sting?" Now, once again, those words might sound familiar because in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul refers to this writing of Hosea. But this time he leaves no room for doubt that it applies to a physical resurrection from the dead. He says there in 1 Corinthians 15, beginning of verse 51, "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised, imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" Paul obviously drew his teaching about the resurrection from the writings of Hosea. He also borrowed from the prophecies of Isaiah. There at the end of verse 54 that we just read of 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul says death is swallowed up in victory, that is a reference to Isaiah 25 and verse 8. Now, while Hosea preached to the people of Israel, Isaiah spoke primarily to the people of Judah. And in Isaiah 25, speaking of the future victory of God's people, he prophesied in verse 8, "He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken." So again, Paul's reference to death being swallowed up obviously must refer to this prophecy of Isaiah. In fact, no doubt the mention here of God wiping away tears probably brings to mind, to your mind, to our minds, also the beautiful words of Revelation 21 and verse 4, where John, describing the new heaven and the new earth that he was allowed to foresee, says that God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And certainly at times in this life, just like last week when we lose dear loved ones, what comfort we can find in those words. Well, back to Isaiah. In chapter 26 of Isaiah, verse 19, we notice another seeming reference to the resurrection. There the prophet says, "Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy, for your dew is the dew of light, and the earth will give birth to the dead." And then we also find in Isaiah the 53rd chapter, which nearly all Bible scholars agree is a messianic prophecy, describing the suffering and the sacrifice of Christ, as Brother Daniel referred to this morning. But after clearly stating that this suffering servant would be stricken, smitten, pierced, crushed, led like a lamb to the slaughter, cut off out of the land of the living, verse 9 says, "And they made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death." And so it's clear that this servant would die. But then in verse 10 it says that the Lord shall prolong his days. And that phrase, and similarly the phrase length of days, that's often associated with resurrection. Another Old Testament prophet that foretells of the resurrection is the prophet Daniel. And I will readily admit that I don't claim to understand the prophecies of Daniel. In fact, I think there's an indication or indications throughout the book that maybe Daniel himself didn't fully understand what he was writing. But in Daniel 12 and verse 2, he says something that I think we can all understand. He says there, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." Now, the reason I say we can understand this is because Jesus foretold something very similar, of a day when the dead would be resurrection and divided into these two groups. In John 5, he speaks of a time when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God and will live, verse 25. And then in verses 28 and 29, he says, "Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment." And so as I hope we've shown, the concept of life after death didn't just start with Jesus and his disciples. It was one that had been shared, I believe, by God from very early on, if not from the very beginning, throughout the Old Testament. We noticed in our introduction when Jesus was approached by those who did not believe in the resurrection that he chastised them for their lack of knowledge of the Scriptures. But apparently some of the Jews, many of the Jews perhaps, did have that knowledge. And we find evidence in the New Testament that at least some of the Jews were not only aware of it, but put their trust in the resurrection. For example, in John 11, verses 21 through 24, following the death of her brother Lazarus, we find Martha approaching Jesus. And she says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." In other words, you could have stopped his death. Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha responds, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on that last day." Now, I don't want to read too much into this, but I have a feeling that although Martha had probably heard Jesus teaching and talking about the resurrection, I think she probably also had a previous faith based on her knowledge of the Scriptures. While the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, that was not for lack of Old Testament teaching on the subject. In fact, the Pharisees, another sect, large sect of the Jews, they did believe in the resurrection, as we saw earlier. In Acts 24, verses 14 and 15, again, as Paul is making his defense this time before Felix, he says, "I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept," speaking of the Pharisees, "that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust." According to an article I read entitled "Jewish Views of Resurrection," in Jewish literature written after Jesus, belief in the resurrection was, and I suppose still is, considered an essential part of their faith. But sadly, they were and they are missing a key point. In fact, the key to our hope of resurrection. What distinguishes the Christian faith is that resurrection is only made possible through Jesus Christ. While other men and women in the past, such as Lazarus, for example, were raised from the dead, the difference is they all died again. But Jesus was the first to be resurrected to live forever. The Apostle Paul refers to Christ as the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 20. And that's the hope that we have, to someday be resurrected to live forever. By the way, we've quoted verses from 1 Corinthians several times tonight, and in fact, that whole chapter focuses on the resurrection. So I encourage us to read it in its entirety and to study and to meditate on this inspiring subject. While Jesus did not initiate the teaching of the resurrection, he and his apostles certainly further developed it and enlightened their hearers and their readers, and us as well, with a clear understanding. And as we've said, the resurrection is a cornerstone in our hope for eternity. It's what makes this life worth living. As one commentator put it, it's the culmination of human history. And I'll leave you with one final verse. Revelation 20 and verse 12 says, "And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged by what was written in the books, according to what they had done." And so the question for you and I today is, are we ready for that day, for the day of resurrection, for the day of judgment?